Welcome back. Have you ever noticed how the same idea sounds completely different depending on who says it? Today you'll see how a student, a CEO, and a detective all speak English differently, even when they mean the exact same thing. Stay till the end. You might discover which one sounds like you. Let's start with the lazy student. They don't really ask, they inquire. They don't forget, they overlook. They don't finish early, they breeze through the work. They don't submit, they hand in. They don't check carefully, they just glance at it. They don't properly follow, they tag along. They don't deeply learn, they absorb. They don't solve, they attempt. They don't read notes, they skim. They don't relax, they lounge. They don't do tasks, they somehow handle them. They don't really try, they just attempt again. They don't finish, they complete. They don't give up, they abandon. They don't think, they contemplate. They don't study, they skim again. They don't read, they glance. They don't write, they scribble. They don't answer, they respond. And they never plan, they always postpone. Let's start with the CEO. They don't clean, they tidy. They don't neglect, they ignore. They don't listen, they tune in. They don't wake, they drag themselves up. They don't understand, they grasp. They don't copy, they replicate. They don't organize, they shuffle. They don't speak, they mumble. They don't prepare, they throw things together. They don't revise, they glance over. They don't participate, they half-heartedly join. They don't hire, they recruit. They don't fire, they terminate. They don't grow, they expand. They don't discuss, they deliberate. They don't direct, they steer. They don't approve, they endorse. They don't negotiate, they bargain. They don't report, they brief. They don't track, they monitor. And they don't just innovate, they pioneer. Let's continue with the CEO. They don't explain, they articulate. They don't manage, they supervise. They don't organize, they coordinate. They don't give, they provide. They don't review, they evaluate. They don't build, they establish. They don't influence, they shape. They don't communicate, they present. They don't invest, they allocate. They don't resolve, they settle. They don't start, they initiate. They don't talk, they negotiate. They don't help, they facilitate. They don't choose, they determine. They don't face problems, they encounter complications. They don't meet, they convene. They don't decide, they authorize. They don't plan, they strategize. They don't delegate, they assign. And they don't just lead, they oversee. Let's move on to the detective. They don't analyze, they dissect. They don't investigate, they explore. They don't discover, they unearth. They don't notice, they perceive. They don't hide, they mask. They don't follow, they pursue. They don't catch, they nab. They don't inform, they notify. They don't check, they examine. They don't solve, they resolve. They don't inspect, they survey. They don't collect, they compile. They don't check again, they verify. They don't deduce, they infer. They don't track, they trail. They don't shadow, they stalk. They don't document, they archive. They don't question, they cross-examine. They don't escape, they evade. And they don't just solve the case, they crack it. They don't observe, they monitor. They don't note, they register. They don't confront, they challenge. They don't inform, they brief. They don't follow up, they pursue. They don't uncover, they detect. They don't interrogate, they probe. They don't examine, they scrutinize. They don't record, they log. They don't apprehend, they seize. They don't search, they investigate. They don't listen, they eavesdrop. They don't analyze, they evaluate. They don't suspect, they question. They don't trace, they track. They don't gather, they collect. They don't verify, they confirm. They don't reveal, they expose. They don't examine again, they inspect. And they don't escape, they elude. Again, let's continue with the detective. They don't look, they observe. They don't find, they discover. They don't ask, they interrogate. They don't follow, they tail. They don't think, they deduce. They don't solve, they unravel. They don't notice, they scrutinize. They don't record, they document. They don't hide, they conceal. They don't catch, they apprehend. They don't make, they create. They don't see, they perceive. They don't feel, they sense. They don't change, they transform. And they don't just express, they convey. So, which character matched your way of speaking? Write your type in the comments, or add your own word version. Don't forget to subscribe and watch the next lesson to upgrade your natural English step by step. See you in the next video.